everyone! Welcome to another episode of Scrap with Me. Today I'm going to show you how to dissect a page. What I mean is, everyone has a layout that they found in a magazine that they really love. And sometimes we try to reproduce it and it works, and sometimes it's not so successful. I've managed to find a few techniques that help me to successfully reproduce and scrap lift magazine layouts, and I'd like to share them with you today. So this here is the layout that I am going to scrap lift. When I look at the layout, I usually look for three things. The first thing I look for are dimensions. I look to see what do I think the dimensions of each of the paper pieces are. Then I look at the papers. I look to see what are the patterns, for example stripes, dots, and solids. And finally I look at embellishments that they've added to the page. Once I've figured out the dimensions, the paper types, and the embellishments, I often like to make myself a sketch, like this one. Can you believe that from this beautiful page layout, I came up with this as my sketch? It's a good thing to keep your magazine around for a reference, but here you can see my basic sketch. I've drawn in a 12 by 12. I've written down some of the dimensions I estimate the pieces of paper to be. I've noted what types of papers are used on the page, and I've also made some notes about what embellishments make the page special. Once I've got that basic plan, showing the dimensions, the papers, and the embellishment, I'm good to go. So next, all I need to do is cut my papers and add my embellishments by referring to my sketch and looking at the magazine for clarification on the design idea. So let's get started. I'm going to need a 1-inch stripe at the top of my page. Now, I didn't have a stripe, but I did have a graphing paper type grid pattern, which is pretty similar. Next, I need a 4 by 12 inch solid. This is a graph paper pattern as well, but the other side is a solid blue with just the lightest pattern in it. So I swapped that out for the plain solid, and I think it works pretty well. Next, I need a 3-inch strip. In the picture, they showed a polka dot pattern. I'm not really big on dots, but I have this pattern, which has some scripty writing in it, which I thought would replace nicely. When I'm looking at pattern papers, I often look to see, is the pattern bold, medium, or small? Is it multicolored, two-colored, or solid colored, with just shading variations? If I can match some of those elements, generally I can match a pretty similar paper. Next, I'm going to need another 1-inch strip. Now I need a 2-inch solid strip, similar to this pattern here. So now we come back to this graph paper pattern, which has been used now 3 times on this one-page layout. Oops, I had some sticky on the other side there. Oh well. And adhere it to the bottom of the page. Alright, so now we can add the photo mounts. I estimated that I'd have a 4 by 6 photo, so I've made a 4 1/4 by 6 1/4 inch photo mount. And I'm going to adhere it just slightly above this third piece of paper, about a 1/4 inch from the edge. I also need some squares to mount photos and journaling on. These squares are 2 1/4 by 2 1/4. I'm going to look at my diagram and also briefly glance over at the book and notice that the bottom layer crosses over this border here and is about the same distance from this photo as this photo is from the edge. So I'm going to tuck it up there and use that as my reference. The next photo mounts will just go pretty much a 1/4 inch away from each other. And it leaves a fairly good space on the right side of the page. So there you have it. I've used the first 2 steps in my 3-step process of analyzing and dissecting a page. I've figured out the dimensions, and I've also chosen papers that match somewhat similarly to the pattern in the book. Next, I get to add my embellishments. I don't have my photos for this page just yet, but I do know that I want to make it a page about my daughter, who is quite the little snuggle bug. So I'm going to start making my letters. In the pattern, it shows solid backings for the letters. However, I think that this spotted pattern is going to do quite well. So I'm going to use these rectangles that are 1 3/4 by 1 1/16 inch wide. I know, precise measurements, but if I made them any bigger, they wouldn't fit on the page. So I'm going to use these papers as a backing for my letters. I'm using these letter stickers from Close to My Heart to add to my letter backings. Now, these are really nice letters because you can do lots of things with them. You can stamp on them, you can texture them, you can do all sorts of things, add embossing, but for the purposes of this layout, I just want to use them white. So I'm going to write Snuggle Bug. The nice thing about these letters is there's so many fonts, and it makes it look really cute having various fonts in the word. We've got our title, but something's missing. On the original layout, you can see that between the two words, there was these two small circles. I'm choosing to use these dimensional elements, fresh shapes, chipboard pieces, mount them on bamboo, and then I'm going to sand them and add them to my layout. So I've got my pieces adhered to the chipboard, and I just want to show you the before and the after of sanding. I'm using the sanding kit from Close to My Heart. I'm sure all of you know this, but just as a reminder, when you're sanding a chipboard element that has a piece of paper adhered to it, you want to make sure that you'll always sand in a downwards direction so that you don't accidentally lift the paper off of the chipboard. So as you see, I've added the two chipboard dots to the layout. On the original layout, you'll notice that between the two types of paper on the layout, there was stitching. In some cases just a straight stitch, but in other cases a zigzag stitch. Now I could pull out the old sewing machine, but I'm not at my house right now, and also pulling out the sewing machine is a little more work than I'm interested in doing. So I like to cheat. I'm going to use this piercing tool as well as my foam piercing mat, and I'm going to add a faux stitch. Now what I could do is I could just use a white pen and draw little lines back and forth. But to make it slightly more believable, I like to use my piercing tool. And I'm just going back and forth, as if I was a sewing machine here. And then once I've done that, I'm going to use my pen and just draw a little line between the dots that I've drawn. And just do dot to dot, like we all learned in what? Kindergarten earlier. And that adds my faux stitching. So the last thing that I'm going to show you on my layout here is this embellishment. I've got this little dimensional heart that I'm going to add to the top corner of my photo. In the original they use a flower, but I'm just adapting to my own needs. I'm also going to add a little bit of texture by just brushing the edges with this sponge and some ink. There we go. We have a cute little accent there. And I'm going to adhere that just using my Tombow. I could also use a glue dot if I wanted to. And I'm just going to adhere that to the corner there. And basically, we are done. So, other than adding some photos and some journaling strips, I've got a page that is ready to go. Again, I'll show you. Here's the original page. And here's my adaptation. So there you go. You can see that using 3 steps, looking at dimension, looking at the type of pattern on the paper, and looking at embellishments, you too can dissect a page and come up with a great layout.